Getting set up, I will give you an announcement that I forgot to give at the beginning, and that was that we are back to having our Sunday night worship services again. If you enjoyed the song that we did with the guitar and the piano, that style of music, that contemporary praise kind of style, that's what the music's all like. It starts at 7:15. Usually it's the same sermon that you would have heard in the morning, so it's a chance for us to all still be on the same page, but just with a different style of music. This week, of course, because we're having something different in the sermon time, I'm pulling one out of my files, so it's kind of a grab bag tonight. We'll see what we get. And we're very excited that for the first time in a while, we're having both a bass player and a drummer come to round out the band, so the band should rock tonight, should be great. And if you're intrigued by that or have some friends who maybe can't come in the morning and that would be just the right kind of thing for them, I encourage you to invite them, 7:15 tonight. And it would be great to have some of us be there just to be in the chairs in case newcomers come so that they don't feel alone. So I invite you to that this evening. Let's pray. May the words of my mouth and the thoughts and meditations of all our hearts rise like sweet incense to you, O God. And may we be challenged and convicted to keep Christ in our minds, Christ on our lips, and Christ in our hearts. Amen. So today we're continuing our exploration of what it means to move toward being an affirming church. We already know that we are a warm and welcoming place, and that we strive to remove barriers for anyone who wishes to join us in journeying ever deeper into the way of Jesus. That's what it's all about. We want to remove the barriers so anybody who wants to worship and explore their faith feels that they can. The affirming thing isn't to make us welcoming. We're already that. We're already welcoming. It's to help us become aware of the barriers that all sorts of people encounter at churches, and to work hard about communicating to people out there that we really are open to them, whoever they are. So part of the journey is to learn about some of the groups of people that are largely absent from churches, because sadly churches have made it difficult for them to attend. Or worse, churches have consciously excluded them by judging them or telling them they were, sinful, as if we all aren't. We are wheelchair accessible here. We have hearing assist. We have large print bulletins. We're comfortable with sexual orientation questions, the LGB part of it. So we're already well on our way. But I'm guessing that generally we're less comfortable with the TQ parts of LGBTQ, the transgender and queer parts. And mostly I imagine that's because many of us just haven't had the opportunity to learn much or to experience much about it. I mean, it's pretty commonplace now to understand a person's sexual orientation isn't automatically determined by their biological parts. Right? That's just commonplace. We know that. But now we're learning that people's gender identity isn't automatically determined by biology either. And that's maybe new for some of us. For those of us who are in the majority, that our biology and our orientation and our identity all align in a kind of classic dominant way, some of this talk about differing identities can throw us at first, right? But it shouldn't, because identity is a constantly changing thing. Your identity is a constantly changing thing. Think about what it means to be a man or a woman today. Now think about what those roles looked like 100 years ago. Generally speaking, 100 years ago, women wore dresses, never pants. They stayed home. They kept the house. They nurtured the children, generally speaking. And men, well, men brought home the bacon, right? Wouldn't dream of changing a diaper, and were taught not to show emotions. Imagine what someone from 100 years ago would think about our ideas of what masculine and feminine are today. Gender norms have evolved in drastic ways, even in your lifetime. Every single one of us has had several identity changes in their lives. Are you aware of that? You've had several identity changes. I used to be a teacher. Being a minister is an entirely different identity, right? So there's an example. Our careers change, our age changes, our location changes. All of these impact who we understand ourselves to be. The most common one, though, is probably marriage, right? Especially if you're a person who took your partner's name. Hands up if you took your partner's name. Okay? That's a huge identity change, isn't it? You have a whole new name and a whole new relationship to explore. That's a new identity. And that's actually very biblical, right? That's very biblical. In the reading from Genesis today, after a life-changing encounter with God, the person called Abram was renamed Abraham, and Sarai was renamed Sarah. Who renamed them? Who changed their core identity? God did. Later in Genesis, a person named Jacob wrestles with an angel, or maybe it's God, and comes away with a sore hip and a limp, and a new name and identity. Jacob is renamed Israel. By who? By God. In the New Testament, we know the story of Simon, who becomes the rock on which the church is built. Simon becomes Peter. Who gave him this new name and this new identity? Jesus did. I'm simply saying that our identity is a complex thing. And the idea that your identity might change from the one you started with or the one someone else gave you is really common. That's really common. It happens to all of us. And so now I'd like to introduce you to my friend, who's going to help us learn some language and gain some understanding into the TQ parts of the LGBTQ issues, because they are a person who has lived their identity story in a unique way. Okay, so friend, this is my friend, Mint Marsalis. And instantly putting Mint on the spot, right? Welcome, let's put you on the spot. So your name is a unique thing. So when I met you, you were named John, and now your name is Mint. Can you tell me something about how you went from John to Mint?
Yeah. So when I was born, my parents named me Jonathan William Marsalis. And sorry, I'm getting used to the echo. And through growing up and getting used to interacting with people in my church and outside my church and at my school, that's where John came from. So there's already a name change there. And then I went to a church camp as a counselor between the first and second year of my undergrad. And while I was there, I was given a camp name, Mint. And over that summer, I was only referred to as Mint. And that became very comfortable. And then I entered into a relationship that summer, and after a couple of months had passed, you know that process where you know someone so well, you're not saying their name very. And you're a person who uses the pronoun they, yes, rather than he or she. Can you tell me something about why a neutral pronoun? Well, it's the same kind of experience as when that partner of mine called me John. Eventually, it just became clear that when people would refer to me as he and him, but more than just pronouns, your grandmother calling you young man, and all of the culture that goes along with that, all of the gender expectations that go along with that, it never felt comfortable, but over time it became less and less comfortable, to the point where it was more comfortable to have sometimes these awkward conversations to say I would much prefer to be referred to as they, them.
Yeah, and that's me. So part of my journey with you is I trip all the time right? I revert back to he, and then I catch myself and I go, oh, no, wait, they. And I mean, part of it is my history is that they is a plural thing, whereas he and she are singular, right? So even that is a hard adjustment. Do you ever wish there was a gender-neutral pronoun that we could just use?
Yeah, I do. Like it's this tear between being realist and idealist. I wish there were our language was like German, where there is a neutral singular pronoun. But at the same time, I'm thankful that our language isn't like French, where everything reverts to the masculine if neutralized. So, you know, being practical with it.
Right. Okay. So I said in my intro that I think we have a good understanding of LGB, of lesbian, gay, bisexual, those sexual orientation questions. But the TQ pieces are strange, new territory for many of us. What do we need to know in order to help us grapple, help us understand this thing? Are there any hints you can give us?
Yeah, so a few things that immediately come to mind. One is that the binary that we know, male-female, just on a genetic level, isn't really a binary. You can call it just random variations in reproduction, but there are millions of people out there who are intersex, and they are often left out of the conversation as well, where chromosomes, body parts, don't align in the way that we conventionally understand it. So that's an easy first step for a lot of people to make, because it's science. On top of that, though, gender has always varied. You gave a perfect example of 100 years ago versus today, but everywhere across the world, the idea of two genders being the dominant way of understanding human gender is actually quite uncommon. There are plenty of other ways of understanding gender, and this is just the one that we currently exist within. Which is why, for instance, the Two-Spirit community with our indigenous neighbors, they often don't like the correlation with trans, because generally trans is understood as being different from that which you were assigned, whereas in their communities, it's not different, it's not queer, it's not accepted, it's just who they are.
Okay, so you just used a couple of words that I'm sure we've all heard bandied about in various places, and sometimes they are confusing. So you said non-binary, as in there's not just male and female, but there is a middle section, and people can exist, their identity can exist anywhere in between or at either pole. There's transgender, there's agender, which would be someone who would say they did not have an identifiable binary gender, correct? Is that how you'd say that? It's not trans as in moving from one side to the other, but would express somewhere in the middle. Can you say?
Yeah, so language within the LGBTQ community has developed rapidly, largely thanks to the internet, and largely thanks to people with common experiences being able to talk to each other. And so there's a lot of different language that has developed, but as it becomes more public and more conversations happen, it often gets streamlined. So the two most common now are transgender, and non-binary. There are plenty of other ones. Queer is very common. Genderqueer, agender are also quite common, but trans and non-binary are kind of the blanket terms that are often applied. And trans is best understood as when you're born and the doctor puts an M or an F on your birth certificate, you are assigned a gender at birth. Trans just means that whatever your gender is now is different than that which you were assigned. Non-binary is, I like how you put that, there's these two poles and you exist somewhere between, somewhere alternating from that.
Okay. So you've used the word queer a couple of times. Some of our experience might be that word is like a slur or derogatory, and yet many in the LGBTQ world embrace it. And you'll find queer studies and queer theology and all sorts of things like that at universities. So how did that word go from being a slur to being an identifier? Or how do you see it?
Well, the way I see it is that it's a signal of difference, and it's a signal of kind of accepting difference in oneself. That's why it's become so comfortable for me. I generally don't go more specific than that because I don't feel it's necessary for someone to understand who I am. I'm a part of the LGBTQ community. I'm queer. That's often as much as anyone needs to know for general conversation. And I think that idea of difference, it's a signal. It's similar to being named. Like, it gives people something very easy to grasp onto about who I am.
Right. So you present as with a physicality. When I look at you, it's what I would associate with clearly being male or masculine, right? That's how you present. So culturally, we make an assumption, right? We assume, oh look, presents like a male, therefore this is a man, and I will use he, right? So that's my cultural assumption. As I was thinking about this last time we talked, when we talk to women, we have this really great thing that we have. It's called Ms., the letter M with an S, because we don't want to make an assumption as to whether the person is married or single, right? So instead of saying, oh, Mrs. or Miss, we found this new language that said Ms., and so we start off with no assumption. We make no assumption, no judgment as to your marital status. We found a way to do it. Mr. is a catch-all phrase that we use for everybody, right? But we don't have similar catchphrases for gender. So we start with even that. If I'm going to use Ms. or Mr., I'm already assigning a binary, right? In some ways, I'm buying into, or I'm acknowledging the classic, you're either this or you're that. Okay? So is there anything we can do, or any language we might find to not assume? Or what do you do when people make the assumption because you present as masculine? So, and this is something we talked about the last time we spoke, that the best thing for removing barriers, since that's what we're talking about with the affirming process, it's finding ways to acknowledge things that the way we understand the world and what barriers might be present. Best things are name tags. Name tags where someone can write their name and write their pronouns. That's a very easy tool for creating a space where it is comfortable for someone to acknowledge how they might differ from that which they are assumed, and create a space where it's okay to put that there. When you're starting a meeting, asking for people's name and pronouns instead of just name is a good way of calling attention to that. But the other thing, and part of my presentation is based on bad experiences in public where I have played around with gender presentation. Because the church is no worse than everywhere else. That's one message I do want to get across here, is that the rest of society is no better than the church is at creating safe spaces for queer people. And so as much as I have played around with presentation and kind of want to continue, bad experiences create those barriers to allowing for that. So you just touched on something I wanted to ask you about. Have you had bad experiences at churches before? Or do you know people who have? I know some people who've had bad experiences at churches, very rarely United churches, because very rarely does it come up. Outside of United churches, there are preachers who will preach anti-gay messages, and those are the most common bad experiences. But in terms of bad experiences, it's more about good experiences. It's more, rather than some ambiguous, neutral, I don't know how these people might feel about me if I told them. It's, oh, these people acknowledge that there is this difference and there is this diversity, and that it's okay to talk about it. Right. And so it's less about what are the bad experiences that people have had and more about celebrating what the good ones have been in spaces that have become affirming. Right, and so, but I'm just thinking about the challenge for us. I'm looking out here and I'm imagining that because this is new, because folks have had an understanding of identity for decades, many decades, have understood men, women, and that's it, So, and if you ever wander onto a news website or a Facebook group and go down into the comment section, you'll see all sorts of nasty responses to people who express gender in different, in non-traditional ways. And so I'm wondering how you respond, or how you deal with the world when you hear things like, oh, that's weird, or they're wrong, or maybe they're just confused, or maybe they're mentally ill, or, because those kinds of attitudes are out there. Hopefully, we would never encounter that in a church, but they're out there. So, do you have responses to that? Do you just ignore? How do you go?
So I generally first go back to those things I was mentioning earlier about intersex identities and the way that even nature and life is not as binary as we would want to assume. Mm-hmm. But the biggest thing, and this kind of scares some people, is just not engaging online in comment sections with people who are not there for dialogue, who are not there for learning. Mm-hmm. And you can generally tell, like, we generally have pretty good instincts about whether a conversation that's happening is good and positive and life-giving, or ugly and hateful and not open at all. Mm-hmm. So as much as that might be uncomfortable, oftentimes it's just not engaging. And that's what a lot of LGBTQ people do, is when there are these signals of spaces that aren't open, is just not to be open themselves.
Right. So why should we bother with all this? I mean, we're talking about a very small percentage of the world, and we're already friendly and welcoming, right? So why bother with all this challenging stuff?
Because more than just the small percentage of LGBTQ people that exist care about these things. One thing that is really important is youth programming, for instance, because that you're not going to have someone who has a secret, whatever that secret might be, that's just going to come up and tell you their secret. It's going to tell you the thing that makes them uncomfortable about being in your space. But if you have a youth program, if you have a place where young people, young adults can get together and become friends and talk, then that right there, without getting into any of the more uncomfortable questions, creates a space where those uncomfortable questions stop being so uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And that's really what's most important there, is creating spaces that are barrier-free, that are welcoming, not just in terms of you can walk in and sing the songs and listen to the sermon, but you can find friends here, you can find family here.
Right. Yeah, this is something we practiced this a week ago, just having an exploratory conversation. And that was something that came up, as Mint said, something very much like what they just said. My response was, one of our goals is, we use language like mutuality, right? To be known and to know one another, but you can't do that when you're all sitting in a row like that facing here and I'm talking to you. If that's the only interaction, there's not much chance for mutuality. And so, as you said, you just become a consumer, right, sitting. Mm-hmm. But when we have coffee time, when we have group discussions, those are times when we sit in circle and we can start to create that space, right? And that would seem to me more helpful. Are there other things? You said name tags. You said creating discussion space. Are there other things that would be helpful to make you feel safe or welcome when you walked into a church, when you first walked into a brand new place?
Yeah, so that poster on the wall was immediately jumps out. The rainbow flag in any of its incarnations is always a useful symbol. For people who are already in the church, in the United Church, that is, the affirming symbol on a website is an immediate sign that this is a place where you can hope to experience comfort. But the other thing that immediately jumps out is that once you've become accustomed to some of the new language, is not getting hung up on it, not being uncomfortable yourself, because that's the last thing I want for you, my friend, is to be made uncomfortable by my presence. Mm-hmm. And so the few times that you have either called me by my old name or misgendered me, you've gotten really good at just fixing it on the spot and not making it the subject of whatever we're talking about. Because you know that that's not the subject, that's not what we need to get caught up on. That's just, it's part of who I am, and we can continue talking about Bible verses or whatnot.
Right. So are there other things messages you want to share or things you want to get at that we didn't get to in our questions?
Yeah, you mentioned before you invited me up, that the change of name and the
seeking of an identity is an inherently Christian message. The one name you didn't mention, I know it's because I mentioned it before, is Saul's conversion to Paul on the road to Damascus in the Acts. The idea of having an encounter with God and finding yourself to be more, finding that who you are with God is more than who you were without God is an incredibly important message. And that's what a lot of LGBTQ youth find in LGBT communities, but also that find in church communities in the United Church that are welcoming. They find that when they are recognized for who they are, that mutuality, that they are more for that mutuality than without it. So that's the other thing, is that not just is the secular world not better than churches, but that churches can offer something really important and essential for youth who are dealing with this kind of rupturous change in their life.
Great. So, I know we're friends, and this isn't exactly new. You've been here before, but how'd we do?
You did well. You are very welcoming.
So Mint will be around after worship today, and we'll have more conversation, and you can ask questions and get maybe clarification. We've thrown some terms at you, some concepts, and hopefully it's been a way to learn and figure some stuff out, and knowing that, we're not just done. It's all part of a long journey, and we're trying to grow. So thanks so much for your openness and your willingness to come. I really appreciate it. You bring a level to it that I could never have got to standing and preaching, so it's very, very rich and very helpful. Thank you, and I hope you'll stay after and chat. Friends, my friend Mint. Thanks.